Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mike Jeremita. I'm an attorney in Pennsylvania and the founder of the gun law firm. From the minute I wake up until the minute I go to sleep, I fight to protect law-abiding gun owners. I believe in the Second Amendment, and I believe in the right to protect yourself and your family, so I help people restore their gun rights. I'm also the host of Mike G in the Morning, a weekly radio program on WFYL in Philadelphia. And our full-length, long-form interviews about firearms, faith, and the human experience are posted on the Mike G in the Morning YouTube channel. I'm here because I'm sick and tired of traditional media. I can't bring myself to sit through the torture of watching the fake news that disguises itself as the mainstream media. It's painfully obvious that every piece of information is slanted so they could teach you a lesson and tell us who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and what you need to believe to be a decent human being according to them. And it disgusts me. Frankly, I'm also sick and tired of the political news networks and their hosts who sit there in their cookie-cutter suit and their boring haircut and spit out the same old recycled talking points they think their audience members want to hear. It's phony, and it's no better for your brain than the fake news. And whether you're the fake news trying to sell me on a narrative, or you're a political talking head repeating the same surface-level talking point that you heard from someone else, I'm done with you. Each and every one of you sit behind your desk every single night and insult our intelligence. Now, I'm also not going to sit here and be controversial for the sake of being controversial. That, too, is an insult to our intelligence. But I will say some things that might make you uncomfortable. Because we're going to dig deeper than the talking points and the narratives decided by an executive at some corporation. You are going to hear what they don't want you to hear. Because when you dig a few layers deep on the talking points you hear from everyone else, you realize that there's more to the story. And none of these hollow, surface-level statements get to the heart of the matter. They don't satisfy the curiosity of a critical thinker. So if you want to be an ostrich and bury your head in the sand, you need to change the channel. This is an ostrich-free zone. You can go back to your talking point safe space so you can be comfortable. But if you got the intelligence that traditional media is so confident that we don't have, I'd be willing to bet that you're sick of the talking point safe space. And I'm telling you that you don't have to settle for that garbage anymore. When we come back, we'll talk to retired police officer Scott Henninger, and he'll tell us about what most people get wrong about the police. And with that, you know what time it is. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. Welcome back. Traditional media separates us into two camps. You're on the left or you're on the right. They tell you that if you're on the left, you should advocate to defund the police. They'll also tell you that if you're on the right, you support the police. And they'll tell you that that means that if you're one of the good guys, you should really just flush your constitutional rights down the toilet. If you have nothing to hide and you've done nothing wrong, just go ahead and make statements to the police and let them search your car, or your house, or the contents of your cell phone. But how in the world does that accurately reflect the view of a party that's supposed to be cautious about big government and government overreach? Our first guest is Scott Henninger. Scott was a corporal with the Pennsylvania State Police for 2 decades. He served in the United States Army, and he taught constitutional law classes in a criminal justice program after he retired from law enforcement. Scott, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Scott, I want to ask you, what is it that motivated you originally to become a police officer?
Well, when I was 5 years old, 2 things happened to me pretty much simultaneously. My father taught me how to shoot when I was 5. And we went to the state police. Used to have a promotional thing, a recruiting tool. It was called the State Police Rodeo. And during part of that rodeo, they put on shooting exhibitions. And when I was 5 years old, I looked at my mother and said, I want to do that when I grow up. And of course, the mind of a 5-year-old boy until you're 24, it changes a little bit, different reasons. And I was always geared towards service of others, and just fit in pretty nicely.
Now, you spent 2 decades with Pennsylvania State Police. You're now retired. I want to get this on the record. Do you support the police?
Of course I do, yes.
Now, with that being said, do you think it's important for law enforcement officers to be familiar with our Constitution?
Absolutely, because if they're not familiar with the Constitution, they can't effectively do their job. That's why. If they violate somebody's constitutional rights while during an investigation, it's all for naught. It'll be thrown out in court, or could be thrown out in court, and they're not an effective police officer.
But is it possible to respect constitutional rights of the individuals you're working with as a law enforcement officer, but still do a good job?
Well, to do a good job, you have to respect their rights. For a while, I was a supervisor. I retired as a supervisor, and I had a lot of young troopers under me. And I tried to instill this in their mind to a very common thing we have to deal with, of course, is search and seizure. And there in Pennsylvania, there are steps you have to go through to properly search whether somebody's car or home. And to try to make it something that would stick in their head, by that time, most of them have known a police officer that was shot at or shot or unfortunately killed. And I said, how would you feel if you would make that vehicle stop, you did an improper search, and you found the weapon of a crime? That would be fruit from the poison tree, and the case goes down because of your sloppiness and not doing things right. For a young police officer, that kind of grabs a hold of them, and I would give that little pep talk every couple months, and it seemed to work. But yes, they have to know the people's constitutional rights to do their job effectively.
Now, aside from that, Scott, now that you're a private citizen for yourself, why do you think it's important for the average citizen to know their constitutional rights?
Well, in reality, Mike, the police have a job to do. Their job is to gather facts about a crime that has occurred. And that is their motivation. The citizen has to know their constitutional rights, so they are not maybe forced or unknowingly walk into a situation that they may be involved in as a witness or a participant in an incident. And they have to know what they can and cannot do, or what statements they should and should not give.
Do you think it's important for them to not only know their rights, but also invoke their rights?
Absolutely. Yeah. The thing that I think is interesting is let's just use the scenario of a shooting. If somebody was involved in defending themselves or a loved one, the best example I can think of is I have looked at many police departments' policies on interviewing officers post-shooting. Some of them even have, you must get 2 consecutive nights of 8 hours of sleep. I mean, using that guideline, I probably haven't been able to talk for the past 30 years. Mm-hmm. So, the police officer knows that. And why do they do that? Why shouldn't you speak after, right at the shooting? Because people say stupid things. Their emotions are up. Their heart rate is up. They have things racing through their minds. And there's a little sick humor side of me. When one of my guys was always involved in a shooting, I wanted to ask them if they were on the grassy knoll in 63, and just to see if they would say yes. Yeah, of course, I never did to maintain professionalism. But, the citizen has to realize that what you say in a heated moment is not necessarily what happened. When we're under stress, crazy things come out of your mouth. And that's why the citizens should know that they have to stop, back off, take a deep breath, and good God, keep your mouth shut.
So is it disrespectful to law enforcement officers to invoke your rights? Let's say you're refusing to make statements, you're refusing to consent to a search, or you're requesting the assistance of counsel. Is that disrespectful to law enforcement officers?
Absolutely not, because the police officers have pretty much the same rights. It's not disrespectful. I mean, one of the simplest phrases an individual can say is, I want to cooperate, but I'd like to speak with my attorney first. And the thing of it is, that is a magic phrase, because any police officer that is involved in investigations, when they hear that, when you invoke your rights, you want to speak with an attorney, if they continue to question you, all that's thrown out.
Right.
And the thing is, the police officer has the same rights too. If they've been involved in any type of use of force incident, they've been read those rights, and some other ones also that just involve police specifically. But no, it's not disrespectful. This is part of the job. It's part of the procedure. And when somebody invokes their right, you have to respect that. And if it's not, it's a failure on the officer's part.
Yeah, so if they don't respect it, if they take it as disrespect, then it's really their problem. Now stick around, Scott. We're going to have you on our panel at the end of the show. But when we come back, we'll hear from attorney Richard Roberts about how he's suing the Attorney General of the United States based on what he says is an unconstitutional application of federal gun laws. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure you've heard people say that the Second Amendment says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and that's simple enough. Well, clearly, in practice, that's not the case. We have gun laws on top of gun laws in this country, and different legislative bodies, different courts, and unfortunately, different regulatory agencies have never been on the same page when it comes to what's permissible under the Second Amendment. And you might not want to hear this, but your rights, under the threat of prison, only mean what the legislature and the courts say they mean. Many people are surprised when they hear that there are people who have lost their gun rights based on criminal convictions that don't seem like such a big deal. Bookmaking, for example, placing bets on sports. Receipt of stolen property, buying tires that were from a stolen car. Theft, stealing lumber from a construction yard. These are real examples of crimes that were committed 30 to 40 years ago, but still prohibit otherwise upstanding citizens from possessing firearms. Richard Roberts is an attorney in Pennsylvania, and full disclosure, he's my partner at the gun law firm. We've litigated Second Amendment cases alongside one another throughout our entire respective careers, and he's the head of our criminal defense and parental rights practice. Rich has most recently been litigating federal lawsuits involving the constitutionality of how these gun laws are applied. Rich, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's my pleasure to be here.
Now, Rich, you have cases where you're suing the Attorney General of the United States for these people, and they're prohibited based on seemingly minor crimes. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about that?
Well, currently I'm litigating 4 separate cases, 3 in federal district court and 1 in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. Each of the 4 individuals have been charged with misdemeanor and 1 felony count, the federal count, where those particular convictions have resulted in permanent disqualification of firearms ownership or possession. The bookmaking that you did in your intro is a case. Driving under the influence is a case. We have federal tax evasion. Interesting about that case is the tax evasion isn't Al Capone, where it's millions of dollars. He literally failed to pay about $250 worth of taxes. And it resulted in a complete forfeiture of his Second Amendment rights.
So what you're doing when you're bringing these lawsuits is You're suing the Attorney General who's responsible for overseeing the DOJ and enforcing these prohibitions and saying, hey, we want court intervention here to say that you can't lawfully prohibit this person from possessing firearms and strip them of their Second Amendment rights based on this particular crime. Am I getting it right?
That's correct. The Supreme Court, a couple years ago now, introduced a new standard for federal firearms regulations and state firearms regulations, where if any government, state or federal, wish to regulate firearms, it must complete and compare with the federal traditional standards of firearm regulation as it existed at the time the Second Amendment was founded, which is 1791. So what we do in these particular cases is look through history, firearms regulations at the time of the ratification of the Second Amendment, and going as far as the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1865. Are the federal firearms regulations today and how they apply to these particular kinds consistent? If they're not, we argue that the particular regulation is unconstitutional. If they are, or the court decides they are, then it would be constitutional and the government can strip you of your Second Amendment rights for that conviction.
Now, you talk about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has really only weighed in on the Second Amendment a handful of times, leaving everyone to fight things out in these individual cases. Can you tell us a little bit about the 2022 decision in particular and its impact on the big picture?
Well, its impact on the big picture is it changed the analysis under the Second Amendment from what it had been previously completely. It used to be a scrutiny test. If you look for intermediate scrutiny when it came to federal firearms regulation, and they also looked at determining constitutionality based on how every state collectively regulated this particular firearms regulation. For example, driving under the influence. Most states, almost every state, criminalizes DUI. They considered it a serious problem. It is a dangerous crime. Because of that, regulation and stripping individuals of their Second Amendment rights for DUI convictions seemed consistent with the Second Amendment. However, now with this 2022 decision, that is no longer the applicable standard. We have to go back and look at the text of the Second Amendment. Does the text of the Second Amendment cover the conduct? If it does, and if it's an individual looking to exercise their right to purchase or possess firearms, carry firearms at will, is the regulation consistent with the nation's history and tradition? So we look at laws, how they punish similar crimes, how they punish that exact crime. If you fail, for example, if you failed to pay your taxes in 1791, what would happen? How did the government recognize that? Did they throw you in jail? Did they punish you? Did they fine you? And specifically when it comes to the Second Amendment, did they strip you of your Second Amendment rights? And most importantly, did they strip you of your Second Amendment rights permanently? Because if they don't, and there are several crimes that you see, if they don't strip of them permanently, and it's a temporary disarmament, that can affect the analysis as well. All these particular crimes under the United States Code permanently strip an individual of their Second Amendment rights with no hope of ever having them restored unless the state provides a way to get rid of that criminal conviction.
And this doesn't have to do with your case, but as an aside, Rich, I presume that we're going to see constitutional challenges based on this history, text, and tradition standard, based on things like magazine capacity restrictions and possessory offenses, things of that nature. Do you see that in the future?
I do see that in the future. I think most gun regulations will be challenged under this code, and it's going to be up to the courts to interpret whether or not the particular regulation fits with the nation's history and tradition of firearm regulation.
Now, you hear a lot of people out there who think that our gun laws in this country are almost non-existent. Do you think the average person, whether or not they own guns, realizes that someone with a 30-year-old conviction for bookmaking or receipt of stolen property can be permanently prohibited from possessing firearms?
Absolutely not. I find people would be quite unaware or ignorant of that particular fact. I think most people, even in somewhat as maybe people would consider serious crimes, 20 and 30 years later, finding out that any of their rights, let alone the Second Amendment rights, voting rights, your right to, control the upbringing of your children has been restricted for convictions. It seemingly would go both ways. The government of the United States does not allow people to rehabilitate themselves. Those 30-year-old convictions carry you with you for the rest of your life.
Now, when people hear about these prohibitions, they'll say, well, with the Second Amendment, they can't do that. What do you say to those people?
Well, they can do it, and they've done it for many, many years. It's been lawyers such as myself, such as yourself, Mike, and people who think, and lawyers who think the same way have been fighting the fight and saying, hey, this is a right like any other. And I think that's the important thing, whether you're pro-gun or anti-gun. If you take away the word gun and replace it with the freedom of speech or the right to vote, it's a right like any other, and it needs to be protected. And I understand people have differences of opinion on where it goes, but it is a right like any other. And coming into court, as I've seen, and I know, Mike, as you have seen, you get that reaction. Well, guns are different. Well, they're not. I mean, it is a right, is part of the first 10. If I said, well, you have the right to remain silent, but not in this instance. Well, it's my right. Well, it's the same thing here in the Second Amendment. And we're pleasantly happy and surprised the way the Supreme Court has gone in recent years, expanding the right and really, as Justice Thomas put it, not treating it like a second-class right anymore.
And ultimately, when people say they can't do that, they really are not using the word can't properly, are they? Because the bottom line is people are being arrested for this stuff and thrown in jail. Maybe they can't legally or constitutionally do that, but that doesn't mean they can't do that, right?
That's correct. And the unfortunate thing is you put a lot of otherwise law-abiding people in a situation where they're being prosecuted, have to spend a lot of money on attorneys to vindicate their constitutional rights.
Exactly. Now, thanks a lot, Rich. Don't go anywhere. When we come back, we'll do a panel with Corporal Scott Henninger and Attorney Richard Roberts. Welcome back, and thanks for joining us. You know, when we have jury trials, there's a process at the beginning to select jurors to hear the case. The attorneys are allowed to ask different questions to the selected jurors, and in a criminal trial, many of these questions are geared towards the jurors' strongly held opinions and even their life experiences. For example, they'll ask, have you or any members of your family or close friends ever been the victim of a crime? Have you or any members of your family ever been convicted of a crime? How many of you believe that because the defendant was arrested and charged with a crime, that he is probably guilty of something? How many of you feel that the police testimony is more likely to be believable or reliable than testimony by any other witness? Or how many of you believe that police generally don't make mistakes? These are all fair and valid questions because our decisions are often swayed by pre-existing beliefs that may be rooted in experience. But they can also be swayed by something we were taught in school or saw on TV. What if our experience is the outlier? And what if what we learned in school or on TV is simply wrong? Here to talk about that is our panel. Retired Corporal Scott Henninger and Attorney Richard Roberts join us once again. Now, Rich, I want to ask you, when you hear these jury selection questions, I know that practicing law is your second career, so you could have been on a jury. I know you haven't been convicted of a crime, but do any of those apply to you in any way?
No, I think I'd be the opposite. Do anybody believe that the police have always telling the truth? I'd probably be the opposite. Just my nature of my upbringing, where I grew up, I have a healthy distrust of police even before becoming a defense attorney.
And how about being the victim of a crime? I know that you didn't grow up in the greatest of neighborhoods. Did you have anybody in your family who was perhaps the victim of a crime?
Not in my family. I've had several friends who were victims of crime, typically muggings and robberies and getting in fights and such. So, yeah.
So maybe the jury experience in your situation would be different than the average person?
I'd agree. It depends on where the person's from. I think it's important when any trial attorney's in front of a jury, you have to know where you're being drawn from. Where a juror lives is important to realize. Just, not the city and state. Are they from Philadelphia? Are they from a metro area? Are they from a more rural area? I think all of those things help determine whether or not what the juror's past experiences are.
Now, Scott, I want to bring you in. As someone who was tasked with making arrests for 2 decades, how do you feel about the constitutional standard that a defendant is innocent until proven guilty?
I feel very strong about that, Mike. The thing of it is, a lot of police arrests are made through witness statements or interviews of other people where you use physical evidence along with it. And I've always kind of had a problem with witness statements because even incidents that I've been involved in, 2 people can be at the same incident and see completely different things. So yes, that defendant should be considered innocent until proven guilty. Absolutely. I believe we've seen in the news, recent news, where people are convicted before any trial. So yeah, we have to make that presumption of innocence.
Now, Rich, a lot of people think that only the bad guys need criminal defense lawyers, and that if you just follow the rules, you got nothing to worry about. Is that true?
It's absolutely not true. Anytime you're approached by a police officer and asked questions, you need a defense attorney. You have a right to a defense attorney. It's the Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution. And I'm sure individuals who you talk to believe that the Constitution is a great document. It was written by intelligent men in 1791, and they put that in there for a reason. You have a right to an attorney for a reason. You should exercise it.
Do you think people are concerned that they're going to look like they're guilty if they do have a criminal defense attorney?
Absolutely, but would you rather look guilty at home or feel innocent in jail would be the question. But I'd much rather look guilty at home and request that attorney.
I love it. I love it. Now, Scott, we have these regulatory agencies such as the ATF who are constantly changing their minds. They'll come up with a decision on how they're going to enforce this particular law and how this regulation is going to be written. And then we see them almost like the wind blows change on this stuff. And somebody who has something which was once lawful, they purchased it lawfully, now becomes illegal. They say you can't have that. I want your perspective as a retired law enforcement officer, Scott. When you have these agencies changing their interpretation and enforcement of the law, is that a problem as a law enforcement officer or even as a private citizen after you've retired?
Well, absolutely. I mean, first off, they're not, part of the legislative body, and they shouldn't be making laws, but they interpret them. And the thing of it is, a lot of us don't really want to read all these, bulletins that they put out or changes in law. Mike, I don't have a TV. I try to stay away from that because it just doesn't interest me anymore. And how am I going to keep up on that stuff? Of course, it concerns me because I don't want to be an unwilling criminal. I don't want to be, for something that I have today is illegal tomorrow. I don't necessarily keep up on that stuff. And I think which, number one, makes it important to have an attorney. It's weird for a cop to say that, isn't it? But yeah, you have to keep up on that stuff, and we all can't do that all the time. The inconsistencies of laws just throughout some states, you could be the unwilling criminal.
But when you have these regulatory bodies, like you said, they're not the legislature making these changes. Number one, is it fair? And number two, is this what our founding fathers had in mind when they drafted our Constitution?
Well, I don't think so. At least that's my opinion. I know that they didn't. I'm certain they didn't. And, something that's why I became involved in something that's close to your heart, too, the Second Amendment Sanctuary Project, where it might just be a little bit of a buffer for us. And, the last thing I want to do is break a law. I enjoy and I love my freedom of retirement. And just having an organization decide one day they're going to start enforcing the law this way, I don't want to go to jail for that. I don't think anybody else does either, for something that was legal yesterday.
That's fair enough. And finally, Rich, have you ever had clients have some kind of gross misconception about the criminal justice system where they either, it's their first time, they're very surprised about how things work, or they even think that you have some kind of secret about the magic bullet to get rid of a case that lawyers and judges are working together or something like that? If so, how do you handle that?
I think it's being upfront and honest and straightforward with a client. Most clients who find themselves involved in the criminal justice system never expected themselves to be there. It's a complete shock to the system the way it works, especially when they may be caught in a situation where they did something that they did not think was illegal. I thought it was something that they could do. I think self-defense incidents are one of the largest culprits of these situations where I thought the law allowed me to defend myself because of X, and it turned out to be a misconception. And they find out quickly that in these situations, knowing what the law is important for them. And they realize that a mistake in not knowing what the law is can cost them decades in prison. Once they learn about how things work and they find themselves in that situation, it's really an eye-opening experience, and they eventually start talking about it more and more. I think the biggest thing that they go in is defense attorneys realize that the criminal justice system works, but it works slowly. They expect me to walk in, I say a couple of words, the case goes away. That's not how it works. It's hours and hours of work, investigation, witnesses, and just the sheer amount of time it takes for the resolution of a case, I think, is surprising to most people.
But we also hear all kinds of things about, well, if you don't go past the bar, then they don't have jurisdiction, or, you're not the corporation, you're the person. Does any of that stuff work in reality?
No, the sovereign citizen individuals I've run into, I've never actually seen that work in a real case before. I know you could probably search that on Google and find it somewhere where they'll say, this is what you have to do when every case goes away. And it makes me laugh every time, because that's not how it works at all. It's the only thing in life where I can run into an individual and not figure out where it came from. Usually I can follow where they come from and where they make the improper left or right. But here I go, I don't know where you're getting that from. And it's never worked ever. And any of those individuals who call my office, I immediately try to get off the phone, because I can't help those people, because no matter what I say, eventually I'm just part of the problem, apparently. So.
Right, exactly. And ultimately, if you did have this magic bullet that you could use, if that stuff were true and you could be undefeated, do you think that you'd be using that in the court of law?
Yeah, I think I'd use it every case. If I could walk in there and say, I'm Richard Roberts. Oh, why didn't you say so? Case dismissed. I'm like, there you go. Yeah, you have this magic bullet. You're just not using it for me. I'm like, yes, because I want to win every case but yours. Right. No, it's very difficult. Being a defense attorney is extremely difficult. We understand, and you talked about it with the corporal, the retired corporal. It's very difficult, the way you're viewed in the criminal justice system as a criminal defendant. And that's the other thing that I think is the most surprising thing. They look at you like a criminal. And I go, yeah, well, you're a criminal defendant. You're going to have to work to make sure that doesn't stick with you going forward.
Well, I want to thank you guys both so much for joining us. When we come back, we'll wrap it up. If you're still with us, I want to thank you for being a part of our free and open exchange of thoughts and ideas. Let's face it, I'm an outsider. I'm not a traditional political television host. I didn't go to school for this. What I do know is that a lot of people trust the mainstream media, and it serves as the basis for what they believe to be the truth. Others distrust the mainstream media and just substitute it with someone else who tells them what to think. What I'm encouraging you to do is to use your head. Think for yourself and ask questions whether or not the person who's feeding you the news claims to vote for the same people you do. Ask yourself whether the talking point of the day makes sense given your values, instead of just getting in line with the agenda. If you agreed with what we spoke about today, then great. If you disagreed with what we said, then great. But I hope that in coming to that conclusion, you did it rationally and actually thought about it for yourself. I understand that some of what we said today is the opposite of the way you've always been taught by people of your political persuasion. Well, guess what? That's the reason I'm here. Because we've always done it that way isn't a good enough reason anymore. That'll scare a lot of people away. They'd rather listen to the same stale programming they always have, not because they find it thought-provoking, but because it makes them feel comfortable, like a blanket or a pacifier. If you ask me, that's no way to live. So if you're not an ostrich, if you don't need a blanket and a pacifier, and you like to think for yourself, come join us again. That's all for today. We'll see you next time.